studies, and what I will do is I'll have questions and answers for both the speakers immediately afterwards. Okay,
Yeah,
David?
Would you like to come up here, in order to be filmed?
Can you say his name again, David?
David Hearne.
Yeah. It's all on the programme.
Okay. David Hearne, researcher, Centre of Brexit Studies, Birmingham City University.
Yeah.
Right, good afternoon everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for having me here. It's good to see so many. It's often a challenge to get people to listen and talk about Brexit. It's I think everyone has had Brexit up to their eyeballs. I probably have, but then it is my job to study the thing. What I would like to do, if that's okay with the organisers, is to give a very, very short sort of talk and then leave most of my time for questions. Because my experience has been, and I've done quite a few events where you end up talking to people in all kinds of different audiences, business people, workers, etc., etc., etc. The most interesting thing is when people talk to you and you can get a dialogue. So if that's okay, that's how I would like to play this. So my stock in trade is as an economist. That's how I was trained. Don't all throw rotten vegetables at once. And I think there's a degree of consensus within the academic economist community, and I leave aside the city because that's sort of like calling a quack a doctor. But there's certainly a degree of consensus within the academic economist community that I very rarely see over any issue, which is that in terms of the size of the cake, if you like, Brexit is going to be a net negative. There is enormous debate over the size of that. There is enormous debate over, is that going to be a small effect? Is that going to be something, I say trivial, as none of us like to have a pay cut, it's never trivial, or is it going to be very substantial? There is a great deal of debate over that. There is also no consensus whatsoever about the impact over how that cake might be split. There is no consensus over what the impact of Brexit will be in terms of how do you apportion that reduced cake, that slightly reduced cake, if you like, by across different groups in society. And obviously that's heavily affected by things like government policy. It's heavily affected by things like the tax system. How progressive or regressive is the tax system? How well are you able to tax the winners from a policy change in order to compensate the losers? So all of that is up for debate. One area where I have done a lot of study, and I had the misfortune to have to read the entire 585-page draft withdrawal agreement. So I think a lot of people are going to have questions over exactly what's in that, what's entailed in that, and I'm very, very happy to discuss that. I know there's a great deal of, there's a huge number of misconceptions about the way the process works, and it's not my place, and it's not my desire to make any party political points or any political points in general. But I would say, in terms of the mechanics of the process, in terms of the mechanics of the process of leaving, some of what people throughout the Commons seem to want is not possible. It is not feasible. You cannot have simultaneously a customs union and be able to sign your own free trade agreements with third parties who don't have an agreement with other players in the customs union. That is physically impossible to do, and I can explain why if people care, or you can take it on trust as you want. So that is a notion which I think we need to, which I think everyone has to move away from because it is physically impossible. There are other things where I think there's a very legitimate question over whether Article 50 is fit for purpose. There is a very, very legitimate question to be asked on a European level. Once all of this has calmed down, once all of the angst of Brexit, all of the angst of a member of the European Union leaving or wanting to leave, whether we do in the end or not, and I make no comment about the political desirability or not. I think you've got two professional politicians speak, and they're much better qualified than I am to answer any questions of that nature. But whatever the political desirability or otherwise, there are very legitimate questions over how the process is structured and whether the process needs to be rethought in order to enable any country effectively to leave the Union if they so desire. And the European Court of Justice has been quite clear in its ruling that the ruling actually that said the UK had the right to rescind Article 50 right until the last minute. The ECJ was very clear that it is an issue fundamentally of national sovereignty that is at stake there. And that is why they made the ruling they did in the way that they did. Precisely because, in contrast to some of the claims about the EU, the nation state does remain absolutely sovereign. Now, in order to be absolutely sovereign, you have to have an effective way of leading the club. Whether that's a good idea or a bad idea is irrelevant. You need to be able to do it. So there are clear questions about the structure of Article 50, because one of the facets and one of the ways in which this is played out is almost by definition now, we need a withdrawal agreement before we have what most people think of as a deal. That is the way it is structured. It is almost as simple as that. So even if you want a Norway plus customs union or any other sort of set of arrangements, Canada plus, however, you can have that debate over where you want to go. But in terms of the legislation, in terms of how you set out how you get there, there is a very real question to be asked about the nature of Article 50, because in essence you are going to be forced to sign a withdrawal agreement before you have agreed on that future relationship. That is the way it is structured. That is the way it is going to happen. Right? If you want to leave with some kind of future deal, and I think everybody on majority in both parties probably want that, then you are going to have to sign some kind of withdrawal agreement. And almost by definition, a lot of people are not going to like what that looks like, because the withdrawal agreement does not set out the future relationship. The political declaration might do. Political declaration does. And you're going to have different people having very different views about what should be in the political declaration. But ultimately, the political declaration from the European Union has no force in law. That is key. It has no force in law. You can write it one minute and you can set fire to it with a cigarette lighter the next. It is that important, if you like. The withdrawal agreement is an international treaty, and as such, it is in some ways even more fundamental than membership of the EU in its own right. And I think that's why a lot of people have issues with the Northern Ireland backstop, which is quite an interesting it's quite an interesting manoeuvre, because it contains some of the provisions over rights that a lot of people are very concerned about. So there is a non-derogation clause within the protocol on Northern Ireland, for example, inside the withdrawal agreement, which actually states that the UK will not lower workers' rights, or certain workers' rights, I should say, not in their totality, but will not reduce certain workers' rights below their level at the end of the transition period, so by 2020. There are also things about maintaining dynamic alignment with the EU's current state aid rules. Sorry, excuse me, I've forgotten the word. So you maintain some kind of dynamic alignment with the EU state aid rules, as long as the backstop applies. Now, as soon as you have a future relationship signed into law, that no longer applies. But in order to get a future relationship, a future partnership, you are going to need to jump through the hoops that the EU wants to set for you. So in that sense, the issue with the withdrawal agreement that I think many people see is that it hands an awful lot of power to one party in the future negotiations. The second issue there is to do with timing, right? And let's not delude ourselves. If we sign a withdrawal agreement, and that applies to this withdrawal agreement, but it also applies to almost any other feasible withdrawal agreement, full stop, then you are going to have the end of a transition period. And if that transition period is short, and the transition period envisaged is very short, then you are going to face another cliff edge. In this particular instance, it's a cliff edge on the 31st of December 2020. And that cliff edge is going to look near enough identical to the one that we face on March the 29th. Right? All of the key issues that we need to be resolved, with the exception, I have to say, of customs. And customs are only a very small part of the checks that need to occur. When you ship goods from one country to another country, Customs are probably the smallest issue, right? The big issues are sanitary and phytosanitary checks. In other words, checks on any kind of agricultural produce. That's key. That takes up, by itself, that takes up 80% of the time, right? Not customs checks, sanitary and phytosanitary arrangements. So there's that issue. You also face the what's it called? Community license. The community license, which is what enables a truck driver to drive onto a roll-on, roll-off ferry at Dover and drive off the other end in France. Without that, they are not legally allowed to drive an HGV, so you need to change vehicles, right? That is one of the issues that Turkey has. Turkey has a customs union, but it doesn't have access to the community license. Now, it is a fact that so far, the European Union has never granted a community license long-term to any country that does not also recognise freedom of movement of people, right? That is a fact. Maybe they would make an exception for us. I don't know. But thus far, such an agreement has never, ever been made. So I just put that out to you. I would also say, in terms of no deal, I'm very, very wary about prognosticating over exactly what will happen. Because it certainly has the potential to be chaotic. It certainly has the potential to be very, very painful indeed. But we don't know exactly what steps the European Union is going to take. And we don't know exactly what steps the UK government is going to take. And in terms of what we are able to let into the UK and how we deal with that, we actually retain a considerable amount of control. Yeah? The issue is that Dover-Calais is largely circular. Right? You can't have all of your ferries going one direction. Yeah? You end up with this to and fro, and it's the same with the shuttle, same with the train system. So the issue there is not about checks that will happen at Dover. Dover is more or less irrelevant. The UK government can do what it bloody well likes. The issue is checks at Calais, right? Because if you delay that ferry when it's in Calais, it can't sail back to Dover. That's where you get your issue. That's where you get your Operation Brock, your Operation Stack, your X miles, your XQ. So you are hugely dependent upon the implementation of rules at Calais. You are hugely dependent over exactly what what interpretation will be given to international SPS agreements. And it is true that the WTO membership gives you a degree of protection in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary standards, as long as your standards are identical. And that is a key issue. And that sort of gives the lie in some regards to this idea of taking back control, because you have to maintain exactly the same standards in order to benefit from this full scope of that protection. It's not complete. You would still need to have certification, etc., and you'd want to negotiate mutual recognition agreements, but the point is there's all of these issues that need to be resolved, and many, many of these issues are not going to be resolved in any realistic withdrawal agreement. I think I've stopped. Thank you.
Thank you.